Imagine this. You wake up tomorrow morning and for reasons you cannot explain, the world looks exactly the same. But it no longer feels the same. The same street outside your window, the same traffic humming in the distance, the same phone on your nightstand filled with notifications, news, noise, and endless distractions. Nothing in the physical world has changed, and yet something inside you has. It is subtle at first, almost like the quiet click of a switch somewhere deep in the machinery of your mind, a small internal shift. But the moment it happens, you begin to notice something strange, something unsettling. The rules of money suddenly start looking different. You begin to see people who struggle financially not as unlucky, not as victims of circumstances, but as people who are operating from a completely different internal setting, a different mental frequency. You look around and realize something even stranger. There are people who seem to move through life almost magnetically, attracting wealth. Opportunities appear around them. Doors open unexpectedly. Conversations turn into partnerships. Ideas transform into fortunes. And yet, they do not always work harder than everyone else. They do not always start with better resources. They do not always come from powerful families or perfect conditions. So the uncomfortable question begins to form in your mind. If effort alone created wealth, why are so many exhausted people still poor? If intelligence alone created wealth, why are so many brilliant people financially trapped? If education alone created wealth, why do some of the richest people in history barely finish school? What if the real difference was never effort, intelligence, or luck? What if the real difference was something invisible, something internal, something that flips? Because if you study the lives of people who built extraordinary fortunes, from industrial giants like Andrew Carnegie to innovators like Henry Ford, from dreamers like Walt Disney to relentless experimenters like Thomas Edison, you began to notice something unusual. They all experienced a moment where their perception of reality changed. Not gradually, suddenly, almost violently. A moment where the world stopped looking like a place of limits and started looking like a field of possibilities. And once that switch flipped inside them, they could never see reality the same way again. Edison failed thousands of times trying to invent the light bulb. But the strange thing is this: he never interpreted failure the way ordinary people do. Where others saw humiliation, he saw information. Where others saw evidence to quit, he saw progress. Where others saw closed doors, he saw hidden entrances. It was as if he had flipped an internal switch that made the world respond differently to him. Now pause for a moment, because the unsettling question is not about Edison or Ford or Disney. The question is about you. What if the difference between struggle and abundance is not outside your life, but inside your mind? What if wealth does not begin with money, but with perception? What if the world you believe you are living in is not the same world wealthy thinkers are living in, even though you walk on the same streets and breathe the same air? Because here is the disturbing paradox. Two people can stand in the exact same environment, the same city, the same economy, the same opportunities, and one of them will slowly build wealth, while the other will remain trapped in financial gravity for decades. Why? What hidden force is deciding which mind attracts opportunity and which mind unconsciously repels it? Is wealth truly created by external conditions, or by an internal switch most people never realize exists? And if that switch exists, who installed it? Was it placed there by society, by childhood conditioning, by fear, by the silent beliefs you absorbed before you were old enough to question them? Because the truth, once you begin to see it, is deeply unsettling. Most people are not poor because they lack effort. They are poor because their minds are operating from a setting designed to reject wealth, a setting installed long before they ever had the chance to choose differently. And until that hidden switch flips, the world will continue to look exactly the same. Opportunities will appear invisible. Risk will feel terrifying. Ideas will seem unrealistic. And wealth will always appear to belong to someone else. But once that switch flips, something extraordinary begins to happen. The same world suddenly reveals doors that were always there, doors you simply could not see before. And the most dangerous part of this realization is this: once you understand how that internal switch works, you can never return to the comfortable illusion that money is only about circumstance. Because the real story, the deeper story, begins inside the architecture of the human mind. And that is exactly where we must go next. The most powerful prison ever built was not made of iron bars. It was built out of beliefs, invisible ones, the kind that enter your mind quietly when you are too young to question them, and stay there so long that they begin to feel like reality itself. Because long before you ever earned your first dollar, long before you ever dreamed about wealth or success, a silent program was already being written into the operating system of your mind. Not deliberately, not maliciously, but inevitably. Think back to childhood. You did not arrive in this world with an opinion about money. A child does not look at wealth and say, "That's not for people like me." A child does not think, "Rich people are greedy." A child does not believe money is dangerous. Those ideas had to be installed, and society installs them with remarkable efficiency. Sometimes it happens through small phrases repeated casually around the dinner table. Money doesn't grow on trees. We can't afford that. Rich people are selfish. People like us have to work twice as hard just to survive. At first, these statements seem harmless, but to the subconscious mind of a child, they are not opinions. They are instructions. And the subconscious mind, the silent architect of human behavior, does not argue with instructions. It obeys them. This is why two adults can grow up in the same world, but respond to opportunity completely differently. One sees possibility. The other sees danger. One hears the idea of starting a business and feels curiosity. The other hears the same idea and feels anxiety. The difference is not intelligence. It is programming. Psychologists have long understood that the subconscious mind acts like a filtering mechanism for reality. Your brain is constantly receiving millions of pieces of information every second, far more than you could ever consciously process. So it relies on a set of internal beliefs to decide what is important and what should be ignored. This system is known as the reticular activating system, a network in the brainstem that determines what you notice in the world. And here is the astonishing implication. Your mind does not show you reality. It shows you what your beliefs tell it to look for. If your subconscious belief is that wealth is rare, dangerous, or reserved for other people, your brain will filter the world in a way that confirms that belief. Opportunities will appear invisible. Risks will feel enormous. And success stories will seem like exceptions rather than patterns. But if your internal belief shifts, even slightly, the same world begins to reveal completely different information. You start noticing patterns where others see randomness. You start recognizing opportunities where others see uncertainty. You begin to interpret the same environment through an entirely different psychological lens. This is why certain individuals seem almost supernatural in their ability to generate wealth. They are not seeing a different world. They are interpreting the same world through a different internal filter. Henry Ford once said something quietly revolutionary. Whether you think you can or you think you can't, you're right. At first glance, it sounds like a motivational slogan, but psychologically, it is far more profound than that. Ford understood something about human perception that modern neuroscience continues to confirm. Belief is not merely an opinion. It is a lens that shapes behavior, attention, and interpretation. And over time, those interpretations create reality. Consider Andrew Carnegie. Before he became one of the wealthiest men in history, he was a poor immigrant boy working in a textile factory. By the logic of circumstance, Carnegie should have remained trapped in that environment. But something unusual happened. He encountered ideas that reshaped his perception of possibility. He began reading the writings of thinkers who believed that wealth could be created through imagination, organization, and persistence. And once that belief entered his mind, it rewired the way he saw opportunity. He started noticing business patterns others ignored. He started asking questions others never thought to ask. He began interpreting ordinary events as strategic opportunities. In other words, the external world did not change. His internal switch flipped, and that internal shift altered the trajectory of his entire life. But here is the deeper, more troubling reality. Most people never question the programming they received about money. They inherit it the same way they inherit language, culture, and social identity, quietly, automatically. And once those beliefs settle into the subconscious, they begin to control behavior in subtle but powerful ways. A person with a scarcity mindset will unconsciously sabotage opportunities that require risk. A person who believes wealth is immoral will experience guilt when earning more. A person who believes success is rare will hesitate before stepping into environments where success is possible. And because these beliefs operate below conscious awareness, they feel like personality rather than conditioning. People say things like, "I'm just not good with money. I'm not the entrepreneurial type. I'm not cut out for business." But these are not facts. They are echoes of beliefs installed years, sometimes decades earlier. And the most dangerous part of this hidden system is that it disguises itself as reality. You do not feel programmed, you feel logical. You do not feel conditioned, you feel cautious. You do not feel limited, you feel realistic. Yet history tells a different story. Every great innovator who changed the financial landscape of their era, Carnegie, Rockefeller, Ford, Disney, had one thing in common. They stopped accepting the inherited mental limits of their environment. They refused to see the world the way everyone else saw it. And when that refusal reached a certain intensity, the switch flipped. But here is the unsettling truth. Before that switch flips, something else happens, something far more dangerous than simply lacking wealth. The mind becomes comfortable inside the prison of its own beliefs. And once comfort enters the prison, escape becomes far more difficult, because you cannot break free from a cage you cannot see. And that invisible cage is shaping far more of human life than most people ever realize. Which brings us to the next, more disturbing realization. What happens to a person, to a society, when millions of minds are unknowingly living inside the same invisible limitation? Now imagine something far more unsettling. Not one mind, but millions of minds operating under the same invisible switch. Entire societies walking through the same streets, attending the same schools, working the same hours, yet unconsciously filtering reality through the same inherited belief: wealth belongs somewhere else. This is where the consequences begin to spread far beyond personal finance, because when the internal switch remains locked in the position of limitation, it does not only affect money, it begins to shape identity. You start seeing yourself not as a creator of opportunity, but as someone who must wait for opportunity to appear. And that subtle difference changes everything. The mind becomes cautious, not strategically cautious, but psychologically cautious. Ideas appear, but they feel unrealistic. Possibilities arise, but they feel dangerous. Opportunities knock, but the door opens only halfway. Why? because the brain is wired for survival, not expansion. Deep within the human nervous system lives a mechanism that neuroscientists call loss aversion. It is a cognitive bias so powerful that losing $100 produces nearly twice the emotional pain of gaining $100. The brain experiences loss like a threat, and threats trigger fear. Now consider what happens when a mind that already carries beliefs of scarcity encounters financial risk. The brain interprets opportunity not as a doorway, but as a potential loss. And in response, it activates the ancient alarm systems of survival. The amygdala begins firing signals of caution. Stress hormones increase. The imagination starts producing worst-case scenarios. What if I fail? What if I lose everything? What if people laugh at me? What if I'm not capable? Suddenly, the mind that might have created something extraordinary begins negotiating with fear, not consciously, biologically. And over time, this pattern produces something even more dangerous than fear. It produces normalization. The person adapts to limitation. They begin organizing their entire life around avoiding financial risk rather than pursuing financial growth. Safer job choices, safer investments, safer ambitions, safer conversations. The dream quietly shrinks until it fits inside the comfort zone of their existing beliefs. But here is the deeper consequence. When millions of individuals adopt the same cautious psychology, an entire culture begins to reflect it. You start hearing the same warnings repeated everywhere. Be realistic. Don't aim too high. Play it safe. Most businesses fail. Money changes people. At first glance, these statements appear wise. They sound responsible, but they also reinforce the very mental boundaries that prevent transformation. Because every time the mind hears a message that confirms its existing fears, the neural pathways of limitation grow stronger. This is how entire societies become conditioned to believe that wealth creation is rare, not because opportunity is scarce, but because belief is. The paradox becomes visible when you observe the small minority of people who somehow escape this psychological gravity. These individuals move differently, not because they lack fear, but because they interpret fear differently. Where others see danger, they see feedback. Where others see uncertainty, they see possibility. Where others see risk, they see leverage. They are operating with a different relationship to uncertainty, and uncertainty is the birthplace of wealth. Think about the great transformations in economic history. Henry Ford introducing mass production. Walt Disney imagining entire worlds where none existed before. Elon Musk investing fortunes into technologies that most people considered impossible. Each of these individuals encountered enormous uncertainty, but instead of interpreting uncertainty as a signal to retreat, they interpreted it as a signal to explore. This is where the internal switch begins to reveal its true power. It does not merely change your beliefs, it changes how your brain interprets reality itself. Two people encounter the same opportunity. One sees danger, the other sees potential. One retreats, the other advances. And over years, sometimes decades, those tiny psychological decisions compound into dramatically different lives. But the unseen consequences extend even deeper, because once the brain becomes accustomed to limitation, it begins defending that limitation. If someone introduces a bold idea, the mind quickly lists reasons it will not work. If someone achieves financial success, the mind searches for explanations that reduce the achievement. They got lucky. They had connections. They were born into it. These explanations protect the ego from confronting a more uncomfortable possibility, the possibility that the barrier was never external, but internal. And that realization can feel threatening because it suggests that the mind itself might be responsible for the boundaries it experiences. Yet this is also where the story begins to change, Because once you recognize the invisible forces shaping your perception, you begin to see the prison walls. And the moment you see them, they lose some of their power. The hidden beliefs become visible. The cognitive biases become recognizable. The automatic fear responses begin to feel less like truth and more like inherited patterns. But recognition alone is not enough. Seeing the cage is only the beginning. The real transformation begins when you decide to do something most people never attempt. Not simply improving your habits, not simply working harder, but rewiring the internal switch itself. Because once that switch flips, fear becomes information, uncertainty becomes fuel, opportunity becomes visible, and the same world that once felt closed begins revealing possibilities everywhere. But how exactly does that switch flip? And why do only a few people ever manage to trigger it? The answer requires a kind of rebellion, one that begins entirely inside the mind. Every revolution in human history began with a moment when someone stopped accepting the rules that everyone else quietly obeyed. The same is true inside the mind. The internal switch that separates scarcity from wealth does not flip through comfort. It flips through rebellion. Not rebellion against society in the loud, chaotic sense, but a quieter, far more radical rebellion. The refusal to keep believing what you were taught about your own limits. Because at some point, every person who eventually creates extraordinary wealth encounters the same internal confrontation. They begin to suspect that the rules they inherited about money are not laws of reality, but opinions repeated so often they became invisible. This suspicion is the spark. It is the moment when the mind starts asking questions that most people never dare to ask. What if the beliefs you were given about money were designed for survival, not expansion? What if the caution that was praised in childhood was actually training your brain to reject opportunity? What if the reason wealth seems distant is not because it is rare, but because your mind has been trained not to recognize it? Once these questions appear, the rebellion begins, because the mind cannot return to unconscious obedience after it has begun to question its own programming. Look closely at the turning points in the lives of those who built fortunes, and you will see this rebellion everywhere. When Henry Ford announced that he intended to produce automobiles for the average person, experts mocked him. Automobiles were luxury items. Only the wealthy could afford them. That was the accepted rule of the time. But Ford refused to see the rule as permanent. He looked at the same world and asked a different question. What if the rule itself is wrong? Instead of accepting the limits of the market, he reimagined the structure of production. The assembly line did not simply build cars faster. It broke a mental boundary that had quietly existed inside the minds of industrialists for decades. The same rebellion appeared in Walt Disney. Before Disneyland existed, the idea of building an entire world dedicated to imagination sounded absurd. Investors laughed. Bankers refused funding. Critics predicted failure. But Disney was not operating under the same mental program as his critics. Where they saw financial risk, he saw emotional possibility. Where they saw impractical fantasy, he saw an entirely new industry waiting to be born. The rebellion was not against reality. It was against the inherited belief about what reality allowed. This is the moment where the internal switch begins to shift, not through motivation, but through reframing. You stop asking the same questions everyone else is asking. Instead of asking, "Is this realistic?" you begin asking, "What would make this possible?" Instead of asking, "What if I fail?" you begin asking, "What can I learn if I try?" Instead of asking, "Why hasn't anyone done this?" you begin asking, "Why not me?" This change in questioning is more powerful than it appears, because questions shape perception, and perception shapes action. The brain, once trained to detect danger, slowly begins detecting possibility. Your reticular activating system, the same mental filter that once hid opportunity, begins highlighting it. You start noticing patterns in industries. You notice inefficiencies that others ignore. You notice emerging trends long before they become obvious. This is why wealth creators often appear visionary. They are not seeing the future. They are seeing the present more clearly than others. But the rebellion requires more than curiosity. It requires courage, because once you begin questioning inherited limits, you also begin encountering resistance, not only from the world around you, but from the voice inside your own mind. The old beliefs will fight to survive. They will whisper things like, "This is too risky. You're not ready. You don't know enough. People will judge you." That voice is not weakness. It is the echo of years of conditioning trying to preserve the familiar. But rebellion means refusing to let that voice dictate the future. It means stepping into uncertainty deliberately, not recklessly, but intentionally. This is what separates dreamers from builders. Dreamers wait until fear disappears. Builders move while fear is still present. History is filled with individuals who felt the same fear you feel when standing on the edge of change. Thomas Edison felt it every time another experiment failed. Walt Disney felt it when he risked bankruptcy building Disneyland. Carnegie felt it when he left the safety of employment to build an empire. But each of them did something that quietly rewired their minds. They acted despite the old beliefs, and every time they acted, the brain received new evidence, evidence that possibility was real, evidence that risk could produce reward, evidence that their inherited limits were not permanent. Slowly, the internal switch began to shift. The world started responding differently. Opportunities multiplied. Confidence replaced hesitation. Momentum replaced doubt. This is the hidden mechanism behind transformation. Action rewrites belief, and belief rewrites perception, which means the rebellion is not just philosophical, it is neurological. Every courageous decision strengthens the neural pathways of expansion. Every avoided opportunity strengthens the neural pathways of limitation. Over time, these pathways determine the direction of an entire life. But the rebellion leads to an even deeper realization, one that very few people ever reach. Because flipping the internal switch does not simply change how you think about money. It changes how you understand reality itself. And when that realization arrives, everything you believed about wealth begins to look different. The struggle, the fear, the endless search for opportunity, all of it suddenly makes sense. Because the greatest truth about wealth was never hidden in markets or industries. It was hidden inside the architecture of the mind all along. At some point in this journey, a realization appears that changes everything. Not gradually, not politely, but with the quiet force of something that suddenly makes the past make sense. You began to understand that wealth was never simply about money. Money was always the surface, the visible layer, the scoreboard. But the real game was always happening somewhere deeper, inside perception, inside belief, inside the invisible architecture of the mind. Because the moment the internal switch flips, something extraordinary begins to happen. You stop chasing money, and instead you start seeing systems. You start noticing that every fortune in history was not created by chasing money directly, but by building something that organized human value in a new way. Carnegie did not chase money. He built a steel system that powered industrial expansion. Ford did not chase money. He built a production system that redefined manufacturing. Disney did not chase money. He built emotional worlds that people wanted to experience again and again. Money followed the system. But here is the deeper realization that most people miss. The ability to see systems emerges only after the internal switch flips, because before that shift happens, The mind is trapped inside a survival-based perspective. It looks for income. It looks for stability. It looks for safety. But once the switch flips, the mind begins searching for leverage. You stop asking, how can I earn money? And you begin asking, how can I create something that multiplies value? That shift alone separates ordinary financial thinking from extraordinary wealth creation, because income requires constant effort, but leverage allows effort to compound. This is why the greatest fortunes in history were not built through labor, but through vision combined with systems. Once you see this pattern, another truth becomes impossible to ignore. The world is filled with value waiting to be organized, problems waiting to be solved, experiences waiting to be created, ideas waiting to be structured into something that serves millions of people at once. But most people never see these possibilities, not because they lack intelligence, but because their internal switch remains in survival mode. Their perception filters the world through fear rather than curiosity. So they walk past opportunity every single day without recognizing it. The same way a person wearing tinted glasses cannot see the true colors of the world around them. But once the internal switch flips, perception itself begins to change. The mind becomes curious instead of cautious. You start asking strange questions. Why does this industry operate this way? Why do people struggle with this problem? What would happen if this process was redesigned? And slowly, patterns begin to appear. What once looked like chaos begins to reveal structure. What once looked like luck begins to reveal strategy. The mind starts seeing the hidden connections between ideas, people, needs, and solutions. And suddenly, wealth begins to look less like a mystery and more like a natural consequence of creative thinking. But here is the most powerful realization of all. The switch was never outside you, not in the economy, not in the market, not in opportunity. The switch was always inside your perception, which means something extraordinary is also true. The moment you take responsibility for that internal switch, your relationship with reality changes forever. You stop waiting for permission. You stop waiting for perfect conditions. You stop waiting for someone else to create the opportunity, because you realize something quietly revolutionary. Opportunity is not found, it is recognized. And recognition depends entirely on the lens through which you view the world. This is why two people can live in the same environment, yet experience completely different lives. One sees obstacles, the other sees puzzles. One sees risk, the other sees leverage. One sees limitations, the other sees unfinished possibilities. The difference is not talent. The difference is not luck. The difference is perception. And perception, once rewired, begins changing everything else. Your decisions become bolder. Your thinking becomes more strategic. Your patience grows deeper. You start building instead of merely reacting. And slowly, almost quietly at first, the world begins responding to you differently. Opportunities appear. Conversations turn into collaborations. Ideas turn into ventures. What once felt like struggle begins to feel like momentum, not because the world suddenly became generous, but because you finally learned how to see it. And that is the haunting truth about wealth. It was never hiding from you. It was waiting for the moment when your mind became capable of recognizing it, which means the most important question was never, how do I get rich? The real question was always, when will my internal switch flip? Because once it does, you will realize something both empowering and unsettling. The world you thought you were living in was never the real one. The real world was always richer, more flexible, and more full of possibility than you were trained to believe. And now that you can see it, you cannot unsee it. From this moment forward, every idea you encounter will look different. Every opportunity will carry a new kind of weight. And every decision will quietly ask the same question again and again. Are you still operating from the old setting, or has the switch truly flipped?